he mentioned, he used the term Pedro Pan, sometimes known as Operation Pedro Pan. How many folks here tonight are familiar with what this was? Just a tiny handful. And if I said to you, or if you're familiar with what the Kindertransport was during World War II, how many hands would go up? A few more. We're more familiar with that, right? The attempts of parents in some of the occupied countries to send their children to some of the freer Western European countries. They would put their kids on trains, right? So what happened in Cuba is that a very similar thing began, that there were flights where they were sending unaccompanied minors. Families were deciding that because the party wanted to begin to take the children for training, indoctrination, work camps, working for the party, working for the revolution, and they were concerned about what the future might hold for their children. Parents were starting to send their children, almost always on flights to Miami, as unaccompanied minors, and it became known as Operation Pedro Pan, Peter Pan. And over the course of, I think, about 2 years, 14,000 unaccompanied children were sent by their parents to Miami. Now, many of them were, the thought was that they were going to be met by relatives. Many were not to be met by relatives, so they didn't have any relatives. There was the hope for the parents that once their children were there and safe, and a lot of them were ending up in orphanages run by the Catholic Church in the Florida and Miami area, that the parents would eventually be able to come over and join their children. I think some parents did. Certainly were able to leave Cuba and become reunited with their children, and many families were not. I want to throw this over to Michael, because this may be a nice segue if you could talk a bit about Pedro Pan, and also a bit about what was going on around the revolution, around the time of 58, 59, 60. What was that all about?
As you noted before, the Castro regime came in with the idea of creating a revolutionary society, and that meant creating the new revolutionary man. And they talked about it. This is one of Che Guevara's key ideas, or his hobby horses. He wanted to strip away the corrupt, the materialistic motivations that move people, and to turn the Cuban man and woman and child into a good socialist, to think in terms of the state, the well-being of society, and not simply their own well-being and their own wealth. So, but in order to create the Cuban, the revolutionary man, they had to kind of brainwash them. And there were a lot of people who just weren't, they were too old to be brainwashed. But the children, they began to say, well, we're going to send them out into camps. Let's tell them about warfare, or about guerrilla warfare. Tell them about the good that their government's going to bring to them, and take the next generation and turn them into good socialists. And the remarkable thing, Rick, is that my wife and I were going across the island about 5 years ago, and we saw these enormous 2- or 3-story schools out in the countryside, in the middle of the fields and the orchards. And we asked somebody, what is that? And they said, well, those are the high schools. What high schools are doing out here? Well, the government had decided, this is only 5 years ago, to force young people who were ready to go to college, force them first to spend 4 or 5 years in these high schools out in the middle of the agricultural regions, work in the day and study at night, completely separated from their families. So this was another way, is, continuing attempt to change the minds, to win over the minds of young people. Now we have friends there who were horrified at that. They would, the last thing that they would allow was their kids to be taken off at the age of 12, 13 years old to spend several years out in the countryside like that.
This exodus, I understand, that was not just the children, that scores of the intelligentsia class, the professional class. I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, I've heard that 50% of the doctors, the MDs at the time, chose to leave Cuba after the revolution and emigrated.
Sure. Virtually all the professional class left. no doubt about it. They finally reached the point they realized they were not going to be able to coexist. Even a good friend of mine, Carmelo Mesalago, was a retired professor of economics at Pittsburgh. Carmelo was sympathetic. He was a university professor, sympathetic with the revolution in 1959. He was appointed head of Social Security in 1959. And even he found himself being an intellectual sidelined and pushed out by the hardliners who had fought up in the mountains.
Right,
They made a distinction between los de la tierra, those who had fought in the mountains, and those who had stayed down in the llano, down in the city, and presumably had an easy life in the city. So the serranos, the people who had fought in the mountains, formed a band, and they were the ones that were the inner core of the revolution. So the professionals, one by one, left. The professors left. The engineers left. The businessmen left. And those who stayed, those were people who couldn't get out. So there was the families who were, trying to decide what to do, trying to hang on to their homes, trying to hang on to their businesses and their professions. The opportunity arose through the Catholic Church to have their children taken by the church, escorted to the United States, and then placed with families in the United States and orphanages. And thousands of children left that way.
And in fact, the father, Sonia's father in the play, is a professor at the university, isn't he?
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.